As outrage spreads over the killing of George Floyd in the U.S., protesters have taken to the streets around the world.
Paris, they marched, as they did in Rome and Tokyo.
Those of us that feel more uncomfortable, most uncomfortable with what's going on, and more shocked by what's going on, you've had it too comfortable. So it's just, this is what happens when you have change. You know, plenty of us know what it feels like to be uncomfortable. So welcome to the club. I'm Trevor Massiah, I'm 54. I work as a climbing instructor. I run a company called Rock and Sun, and we run climbing courses and holidays right across Europe and further afield, places like Morocco and Thailand. First time I went climbing was 1984. I'd already done a little bit of caving, a little bit of kayaking, and then I went to an activity centre it would have been, I think, sometime around Easter 1984. I was going there to see if I wanted to do a work placement as a youth training scheme placement for the summer of 1984. And that was my first climbing experience. At the weekend there, we went to a sea cliff in Pembrokeshire called Porthclais and abseiled down in the rain, climbed back up some route in the rain with the sea crashing below. Pretty unpleasant experience, to be honest. You know, didn't really get it, but obviously something kind of twigged eventually. And I think pretty much it happened for me once I started lead climbing. My parents came to the UK in the late 50s. My mother was from Antigua and my father from Barbados. So they were part of that Windrush generation. I mean, obviously the Windrush was the first ship that came over with a huge amount of people from the Caribbean, but people from, you know, the former empire, the Commonwealth, were invited over to work. So my parents came over as part of that. They met in the UK and started a family in Bristol. I was born in '65, and the sort of things you just had to take for granted back then was you would have to deal with racism on a daily basis. So it's interesting to think about whether that's difficult or not, because at the time as a child it's upsetting and it's hard, but it's also something you get used to and hardened to very quickly. So obviously my parents were very supportive and made us proud of who we were, proud to be black, and you know, gave us good advice on how to manage growing up in what was a hostile environment. We were, I think, probably the first black family in a very big working class white housing estate. But I've still got great friends from that time. Some of my brothers still live there, and my parents still live there. So that just demonstrates that it wasn't all bad. Growing up as a child in a predominantly white society, you just have to accept, and at the time you don't know that, of course. As a child, you've got no idea that what you're experiencing is so rare in a way, because my family in the Caribbean had the luxury of growing up in a black society. Even some of my cousins had the luxury of growing up in an inner city area where there were a lot more black faces around. Whereas we as a family grew up in a white neighborhood. So therefore, yeah, I had, you know, it seemed to me, looking back, like I had years of having to deal with being called names on a daily basis, multiple times, sometimes 15, 20 times a day. It would get to the point where you kind of realize that if you were gonna, you know, punch everyone that called you a nigger, then you were gonna have to hit the little kids, but the big kids as well, you know, and sometimes you did. I mean, I got into fights on a daily basis. There's definitely a disparity of minorities that are engaged in the activity of climbing or mountaineering as a whole. When you look at it from the outside, it does look predominantly white, but of course you're talking about minorities, so by definition there are going to be less, you know, and it's whether it's a much smaller percentage than is representative of society as a whole. So I think the problem with just looking at it as it is right now is you also have to look at the historical reasons for that. I mean, you know, if you look back to climbing before the war, it was predominantly sort of upper middle class or upper class people, and then it wasn't until after the war that the working classes started going out to the gritstone edges and getting the mountains in the Lake District and getting involved in climbing. So that's been a change over the years from the 50s onwards. If you have an influx of immigration, of immigrants into a country like the UK, it's obvious that can't really describe climbing as anything other than frivolous. So, you know, a frivolous activity like climbing, you need to have some kind of historical connection to the sport, and that's not going to be the case if you're, you know, from an African country or from the Caribbean or from Asia, for instance. You're going to have affinities with things like football and cricket. Those are the things that you might be used to doing, and your parents might be used to doing, and also those things have a certain value to them. You could become a footballer or a boxer or an athlete and make money out of that. But you know, to go rock climbing or mountaineering, it's so foreign if you come from those cultures. So I think there would always be a slow uptake of people filtering into that activity. It's interesting looking at the questions whether there is systemic racism within the climbing community. And in my experience, I would say there isn't. It's just not something that I can relate to. So I would say from my personal experience that climbing has been very open, welcoming. In general, people just seem to have a different way of thinking about things. And I think that's what living in the outdoors tends to do. You meet a very diverse amount of people. I mean, I can think of tens of people that I know that I couldn't imagine that they would be my friends had it not been for that shared love of the climbing. I mean, you just wouldn't spend enough time with people that are so different from you to get to know them well enough for them to be your friends, because there would be no reason. But it's that thing that you end up forging really strong ties and relationship with people. And you know, I can honestly say that racism within climbing isn't something that I've experienced. When George Floyd was killed, it was shocking. I think it's really hard to explain, because I think a lot of people were like, well, why does it affect people halfway around the world? And it kind of affects you deeply, because you kind of get fooled into this false sense of security, like things are getting better and things are improving. But the idea that someone's life could be so inconsequential, so unimportant to someone that they could just kneel on their neck for that length of time and allow them to die while this is being filmed, and almost it just seemed like this was something that in their world was acceptable, and it wouldn't be acceptable for anybody. You wouldn't want to see anyone, whether they were black, white, or you know, male, female, being like killed in the street. And somehow you had this sense that has happened many times in the past, that these people maybe felt that they wouldn't be held accountable, or that life isn't important enough to treat that person with respect. The very people that are actually being paid to, you know, to serve and protect, are actually actively just killing people on the street as if that's okay. You know, it doesn't matter what someone has done in the past. You don't deserve that kind of punishment. You deserve to, you know, if you've committed some sort of crime, you deserve to be in the court system, and it's a civilized way of dealing with someone. And far too many innocent people have died at the hands of the police. And it doesn't matter whether you live half around the world. What you kind of realise is that the reason that these things are happening is because of institutionalised racism, and it affects all of us. And when you're a minority, you realise that the freedoms and the life that you are able to have, you have those because people in the past have fought hard to get those. They haven't been given to us, they've been forced. People have protested, people have sacrificed, in some cases, their lives in order to get the amount of equality that minorities have in society. So obviously that was horrific, and obviously emotional, but it kind of almost made you also think as well, have we all just been kind of enjoying, the labor of past generations and what they've done? And it kind of made me realize that if you want to live in a fairer society, you have to be engaged with changing it or trying to change it, because if you don't, then you can't complain when things happen to you or other people, purely because of the colour of their skin.
Black Lives Matter! No! Black Lives Matter!
When you look at what's happening with Black Lives Matter, to me, climbing's not important. It's great if we can share what we love with other people, but there are bigger issues than that. And you're not going to solve the issue of, opening up something like climbing to minorities on a mass level, unless people can afford it. Sure, you can have all sorts of initiatives that get youngsters, school groups, youth groups through the doors to climbing gyms. And maybe you can have some initiatives that get people outdoors so they can actually experience what climbing really has to offer, rather than in a more sort of sterile environment of an indoor climbing gym. But that's not going to make it easy for those people to stay, active or to keep active within the sport. What you really need is people to be able to afford and have the ability to afford and choose what sport they do, whether that's tennis, golf, badminton, cricket, or rock climbing, or surfing. And that's the real problem here, because I think that you can lose sight of what's important here as climbers and start thinking about, looking around your gym and not seeing enough black faces. But I'm pretty sure that most minorities would rather have the chance of having a job that pays well and being able to feel like they have a fair chance to follow their dreams, to use the education that they might have managed to get to do a job that they deserve, rather than feel that there's hurdles in the workplace. I don't think anyone needs to feel guilty unless they personally have something that they should feel guilty about. I don't think anyone should feel guilty about someone else's actions unless they were in a position to do something about that or to stop that. There's lots of stuff that I've seen on social media. People have shared with me that they've been made to feel guilty about their white privilege. And I think that's unhelpful, because if people feel guilty, they tend to become defensive. If you just have a certain privilege because of your colour of your skin, it's no one's fault. It's just randomness. It's just the way it is. It's making sure that you recognise that is present. Other people don't have the advantages that you have, and where you can, doing something about that.
I'm going to be totally honest here, because it's something that I look at that post and I feel slightly guilty about that, because I feel like, especially if I look at my life and the things I've perhaps done, and I've taken things out of context, or I've said things that I haven't thought about, and it's the thought thing that's tricky. Because I think people have a habit of saying sometimes things that they don't think fully through, and then later you feel like a bit of an idiot for having said that.
So when you get these moments of turmoil, it's important to remember that positive will come out of this. So it's just that people's comfortable lives have been disrupted, and that's a good thing. And people start having a dialogue and start thinking. But that's the way society changes. Society generally doesn't get what it wants. People, especially people at the bottom rungs of society, they don't get what they want from, writing letters to MPs. You get it from protest. So that's how you get change. So it might be uncomfortable, it might be painful, but lots of us know what it's like. It's those if you're going to take anything from the privileges that we might have, is those of us that feel more uncomfortable, most uncomfortable with what's going on, and more shocked by what's going on, you've had it too comfortable. So it's just, this is what happens when you have change. Plenty of us know what it feels like to be uncomfortable. So welcome to the club.